It's wonderful to have you all here with us. This is a webinar entitled Digital Trade and the World Trade Organization, the State of Play Ahead of MC14. That's the Ministerial Conference 14, which of course takes place in Yaoundé, Cameroon in March 2026. My name's Alice Tipping. I'm the Director of Trade and Sustainable Development of the program at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and I'm accompanied by two of my colleagues here who will be presenting in just a moment, and two discussants who've agreed to give us some perspectives. So to give you a bit of a sense of what we'll be doing today, we are essentially walking you through a policy brief, a state of play document, which will be published between now and I'd say about the end of the month, which will give you a sense of what's going on not only in the multilateral discussions on digital trade at the WTO, but also in the plurilateral joint statement initiative discussions and the text that that discussion has produced. This, we hope, both the webinar and the publication will be important resources for the upcoming ministerial, where we can expect some topics related to digital trade to come up and to be the product, or rather the target of ministerial declarations and decisions. So what we're going to do for the next hour and maybe 15 minutes is that I'm going to invite my two colleagues, Rashid Kaukab, who's a senior specialist in trade and sustainable development, to give us to give us a sense of how the multilateral work program on electronic commerce is going at the WTO. He'll then pass the floor to my colleague Rashmi Jose, who's a senior policy advisor in our trade team, who'll give us a sense of how the plurilateral discussions and negotiations have been going. After those two presentations, we're very fortunate, and thanks already to both of our discussants, Joel Richards, who's the External Director in the CARICOM Secretariat, formerly in Geneva. So it's wonderful to see you again, Joel. Thank you for giving us your time again. And Cecilia Risolo, who is Minister Counselor at the Permanent Mission of Argentina to the WTO and other international organizations in Geneva. So we've asked Joel and Cecilia to give us their perspectives on the state of play, to think about and to give us their perspectives on what the priorities are at both the multilateral level and what the next steps in the process look like at the plurilateral level as well. So you'll have seen that this webinar is currently being recorded. We're going to stop the recording after the discussants' interventions. We will have some time after that, though, for questions and answers. That question and answer and discussion part of the webinar is not going to be recorded, so you can feel free to put your hand up or put questions in the chat box as we go through, because when we get to that part of the discussion, it is entirely closed. It'll be just the people in this room on this afternoon. So without further ado, perhaps Rashid, I'll ask you to start off with your overview of how the multilateral work program on electronic commerce is shaping up at the WTO. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Alice. I am trying to share my screen now. Let's see how it goes. Yeah, I think it's working. If not, please let me know. So thank you very much, Alice. And good afternoon to everyone. I know some of you are joining from where it is really early in the morning. So good morning to you and good evening to some others. In the multilateral work program, I will try to cover several parts briefly to give a sense of how did it start, what it went through briefly, and then where do we stand now and what to expect from the ministerial conference, which is in March in 2026. This work program was established by the General Council, but before that in September 1998. But before that, at the second ministerial conference of the WTO, which was held in Geneva in 1998, earlier in the year, members agreed to two things. One, they agreed at that time they were not imposing any customs duties on electronic transmissions, this being very new area. So the members agreed as part of this ministerial declaration that they will continue this practice of not imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions. This is famously called the moratorium on customs duties. But in this declaration, they also directed the General Council to establish a work program to study electronic commerce at the multilateral level involving all of WTO. And General Council then did that in September 1998, so that there's a work program to look at the relationship of various agreements of the WTO with electronic commerce, and then also examine all issues related to the moratorium. And then, of course, this work was assigned to 4 bodies, depending on their issue competence in trade in goods, in trade in services, on intellectual property related aspects, as well as the Committee on Trade and Development, and General Counsel overall supervised and monitored that work. In this long time, let's say 27 years, a little more than 27 years, we can see, if we look at in this work program, simply looking at the submissions by members, we see a lot of engagement, but a lot, rather an uneven engagement also. The initial period saw a lot of interest and a lot of discussions. Then it seemed to have gone down, but since 2016, which is after the Nairobi Ministerial Conference, there is a big uptick which continues, where there's a lot more engagement by members in this work program. Moving to the moratorium, because as I mentioned, in the work program, members are also to discuss this moratorium on customs duties. This started in 98, where members agreed to continue this practice. And this moratorium was till the next ministerial conference, which then happened in Seattle, the 3rd ministerial conference. At each ministerial, since then, broadly speaking, the decision has been taken to continue extending this moratorium, but almost always till the next ministerial conference. So this has been the kind of practice. And last extension renewal took place in March 2022, which was the ministerial conference number 13 held in Abu Dhabi. However, in this last renewal, I would like to point out in that language, there are 2 very features which we don't see in the earlier decisions. One, this decision mentioned that the moratorium is extended until March 31, 2026, or the next ministerial conference, whichever is earlier. So not just the ministerial conference is mentioned, but also a specific date mentioned, and whichever comes earlier. Hypothetically, if Cameroon conference was not going to take place in March next year, the moratorium would have ended on 31st March. Another unique feature, after specifying this date, there is an additional sentence which did not appear in earlier extension decisions, which says that the moratorium will expire on that date. This one can interpret as emphasizing the nature of this kind of moratorium, that it is going to end. So it was further emphasizing that point. Now let's move to very briefly. This moratorium issue has seen a lot of debate in the last 27 years, a lot of arguments from both sides. Those who want to continue the moratorium, that is no customs duties on electronic transmissions, their main arguments are this is good for the business and growth of the electronic commerce, primarily because it reduces costs, it creates predictability and stability in the market, which is good for growth of electronic commerce, and including also for micro, small enterprises and for digital inclusion. They also argue that if, as a result of moratorium customs duties, countries lose that revenue, they can try to get that, compensate that by imposing consumption taxes like value-added tax. Those who want the moratorium to go away, which includes many developing countries, their primary arguments are twofold. One, both are linked to, I would argue, about the nature of the technological developments which are making things possible now, which could not be even envisaged yesterday. So there we are in this open frontier. So as a result of that, which things can be supplied online, digital, more and more products can be digitized. There can be more and more digital products. As a result, this is kind of an open-ended mandate, and they are worried that that would have impact on their potential customs revenues, which in some cases are quite large as part of their government revenue. And also they're concerned about the policy space laws, meaning that would not be able to use tariffs as an instrument of industrial policy, which has been used often. They also argue that replacing customs duties with VAT is not that straightforward, and the history of that effort shows over like at least for the past 30 years. Now let's move quickly to what happened in this work program on electronic commerce in the WTO this year, 2025. It was a very engaged, intense period. Under the work program, there were a number of thematic sessions. There were 2 or 3 thematic workshops and 1 thematic information session. In all of those, the common elements, I would say, were technical assistance and capacity building needs of developing countries, and also the development issues. So these were kind of the running theme. But in addition to that, out of these 3 thematic sessions, 3 were exclusively titled or linked to the digital divide, development issues, where the members looked at the needs of developing countries related to soft and hard infrastructure, skills, policies, regulations, you name it, and how those digital divide elements can be bridged. Also, there was a thematic session exclusively focusing on legal and regulatory frameworks, particularly to consumer protection, cybersecurity, privacy, etc. And very interestingly, a thematic session also focused on the impact of artificial intelligence and emerging technologies, their relationship with trade policies, trade facilitation, and regulatory implications. And of course, moratorium renewal, of course, that also remain on the agenda, and members had a thematic workshop also on that issue. So as you can see, it has been a year of deep, broad, and very engaging discussions. As part of these discussions, members also proposed ideas of what can the WTO do on this issue. A number of ideas came up, no consensus recommendations, but WTO can be a central hub for information. It should coordinate with other international organizations. It should promote regulatory coherence. It should continue to provide technical assistance and capacity building to developing countries and LDCs, and it should try to clarify the existing WTO rules in the digital context. So these points came out quite clearly. So after that, let's move to where we are going now, which is towards the ministerial conference. So the members' effort is between now and the ministerial, which will be held in late March, to come up with some consensus document which can be adopted by the ministerial conference to deal with the future of both the moratorium as well as the work program. For that purpose, there are at least 2 submissions that have been made so far. One is by this group of African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, which is a very large group of developing countries in the WTO. This has been made on their behalf by Barbados, the coordinator of the group. It is quite a detailed proposal with a draft ministerial declaration, which has 3 important points. One is a lot about the reinvigoration of the work program. What kind of discussions, how much more focus, and how to provide that focus on development. And then also how to deal with the new emerging technologies. It also talks about greater collaboration with other international organizations and encourages its promotion. And it says that the moratorium should be extended till the next ministerial conference. More recently, we saw another proposal, a shorter but very substantive by USA, which for the first time to my knowledge in such submissions defines electronic transmission. So there's a definition, which is a very broad definition, which includes not just the mode of transmission, not the electromagnetic waves, but also the content of the transmission. So whatever is included in that in the transmission, digital product, digitized product, services, whatever, that is considered to be included in this definition. Another, so the US recommendation is that the moratorium should be extended, but does not provide an end date, which means it can be interpreted as a permanent moratorium. And finally, this short ministerial draft declaration by USA has no mention of the work program on electronic commerce, which again, one can interpret probably the end of the work program or its separation from the moratorium issue. So now critical issues, and this is going to be my last slide, critical issues for MC14 on this issue, future of the moratorium, and future and focus of the work program. For the moratorium, possibilities in the possibility horizon, no extension, meaning the moratorium goes and members then can, those who want, can start imposing custom duties. Or an indefinite, which we can call the permanent extension, which means members commit not to impose customs duties till they decide otherwise. Or extension for a specified period, like till the next ministerial conference or till an end date. For the future of the work program, again, the decision has to be made whether to continue it, and then if to continue, what should be its focus, issues should it cover in this extension phase, and how should it integrate these emerging issues. So these decisions are to be taken by the ministerial. They have done it through a single instrument. So that would also be a question, that they do it through a single instrument and separately. All these things will be discussed by members between now and then with a view to coming to a conclusion. So my final thought, with that, I will leave you that I would argue that the work program on electronic commerce in the WTO is the only multilateral forum in this organization to discuss this very important issue, to have a dialogue on e-commerce in a structured way, holistically, and comprehensively. So with this thought, I will leave you and thank you, and hand it over back to Alice or Rashmi for the next presentation. Thank you.
Well, only to me, Rashid, but to thank you. And I think in particular, this last slide is extremely helpful in that it crystallizes the two key decisions and the options that seem to be available, at least based on what governments and members have put on the table, the options with respect to each of those big decisions. And as you see, and as you'll see in my colleague Rashmi's presentation, some of these issues, in particular the moratorium on customs duties, comes up also in the context of the plurilateral negotiations. So these are negotiations going on within the WTO context, but not among the 166 WTO members, but amongst a subset of them. And we'll hear, in fact, right now from Rashmi, the number that are currently engaged and how far that process has taken us. And also very helpfully, what sorts of topics are included in the negotiation of those particular rules amongst that group of members. So go ahead, Rashmi, please.
All right, can you see my presentation?
Yes, it's well visible. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. So as Alice mentioned, my presentation is going to be focusing on the plurilateral process on e-commerce. What I'll be doing is, as Alice mentioned, I'll actually be providing a very high level general overview where I will try to give an understanding as to what this initiative is about, who are the types of members who've been engaging in it, what are some of the latest developments in the process and the expectation and elements relating to MC14. But as Alice mentioned, I'll also take this opportunity to give an overview of what are some of the technical elements that are covered in the legal text that's come out of this initiative. And I'll finish my presentation with some key considerations that can be particularly useful for developing countries. So it's a lot, but bear with me for the 15 minutes or so. So when we talk about the joint statement initiative, it's essentially it's a negotiating process. It's a rulemaking process that just a subgroup of the WTO membership have been involved in over the last few years, who've essentially had the objective of wanting to create a new global level trade agreement that's focusing specifically on e-commerce rules. Currently, there is no agreement on e-commerce within the WTO treaty framework that includes a comprehensive set of e-commerce rules, and so the aim is to essentially fill that gap within the treaty framework. There's different reasons as to why some members have argued why these negotiations are important and why the WTO in particular is the right place to do this. This includes the fact that digital products have become much more important. There's a need for more new trade rules at the global level to create predictability for such products to continue to grow and digital trade to be facilitated on it. Another argument is it's this recognition that currently a lot of the rulemaking on digital trade has been taking place at the bilateral and regional levels. And essentially, the argument is that now would be an important time to leverage some of the developments and the innovations that have taken place there, to consolidate it and to converge it towards essentially what could become a baseline type agreement that could be applied at the global level that more countries would be willing to adopt. And the third reason as to why some members have argued as to why this type of negotiations is important is it's one that's typically raised within this broader conversation that's happening on WTO reform. And it's this argument that, well, these types of plurilateral negotiations are important to essentially showcase to ensure that the WTO as an institution can remain relevant, that its negotiating function can still deliver new rules, and that this can be a forum in which global level trade rules can be created and can be a platform for cooperation. So these are some of the key reasons that we hear as to why some members have argued that these negotiations are important and it should be taking place at the WTO. But as we mentioned, this is, however, a plurilateral process, which means that not all WTO members have been engaging in these negotiations. Just the subgroup of them who have chosen to do so. At present, there are about 91 WTO members who are still listed as Joint Statement Initiative participants in this process. In terms of the types of countries who've been engaging, well, I mean, developed country participation was particularly high. In high major economies such as, for example, the US, EU, China were all quite active during the negotiating period. However, when it comes to developing country participation, this tended to be a little bit more varied and really depended on the region from which the country came from. For example, there tended to be higher participation from countries from the Latin American and Asian regions, not so much engagement from the African region. Only 9 African countries were engaging in this process. No participation from any countries from the Pacific and Caribbean countries. And in terms of LDC participation in this process, this also was quite low, with only 5 LDCs having engaged in these negotiations. What I'm going to do now is give you a very, very high level overview on the process and what are some of the developments there. It's a very detailed timeline. I'm not going to go into the specifics, but the main takeaways to take note of here when it comes to the process is the initiative, the initiative was launched back in December 2017. And it's already completed some major milestones, the most important being that the technical negotiating part of this process has already been finalized. It's concluded. It was finalized back in November 2024, so last year. Out of this process, a legal text has been produced and it's considered as completed and closed, so no more substantive changes can be made to that legal text. In terms of what are some of the key developments that are happening right now with the process, the efforts are really focused on essentially trying to now make this agreement into a formal WTO agreement, to try and incorporate it within the WTO's treaty framework as a plurilateral agreement under Annex 4. However, it's important to note that not all the participants of the Joint Statement Initiative are in alignment with some of the latest steps of this process. Out of the 91 participants of the Joint Statement Initiative, there are 72 of them at present who are co-sponsoring the fact that that they're okay with the legal text having been completed and the request that it be incorporated into the WTO's treaty framework as the plurilateral agreement. The co-sponsors made their first formal request for legal incorporation this year in February 2025 at the WTO General Council level. They made this request for a decision for incorporation. However, this request did not go through because there were 7 WTO members who either raised reservations or formal objections, which meant that consensus could not be achieved. And well, in order for a plurilateral agreement to be incorporated within the treaty framework, this requires consensus, which means that all WTO members, none of them should be opposed to the incorporation request, regardless of whether they were participating or not participating in these negotiations. Since that February 2025 request for incorporation, the topic of the co-sponsors the topic of a formal decision has no longer been raised at the WTO General Council level, but the issue is still being raised as an item for, essentially it's still on the agenda, but it's a discussion for information item. It's unclear at present what's going to happen when it comes to this agreement and its efforts for legal incorporation, especially in the run-up to MC14. It's not. I mean, it's clear that probably that the co-sponsors are going to continue in their efforts for hopefully, I mean, for trying to get this agreement pursue legal incorporation efforts, but it's not quite clear if there's going to be more efforts to try and get a decision on this. And if they do try this, are they going to be facing a similar kind of opposition, or will there be an ability to get additional buy-in? So all these elements are still currently at present quite unclear. So that's the latest on the process. Essentially, interest in trying to get it incorporated, but very much currently unclear if that's ever going to go through given the opposition. I'm just a final note on this. I'm happy to go into some of the reasons as to what are the debates around legal incorporation, if need be, during the Q&A. Okay, so one of the elements, let me just, is it working? No. Oh. So as we mentioned, there is a legal text that's been produced out of this process, and it is useful to have an understanding of what are some of the key rules that are included in this text. It gives you an idea of what parties would be potentially signing up to should, if this agreement were ever to become a reality. So at present, I mean, so there's about 20 substantive rules within this agreement, and there's a bit of diversity in the types of commitments that parties would be taking on. In terms of market openness and access type of commitments, there aren't that many, but what has been included is considered as substantial and significant and has been subject to quite a lot of discussion during the negotiations. The most important market openness commitment that's been subject to such conversations is Article 11 on customs duties on electronic transmissions. It's the moratorium on customs duties. It's important to note that this moratorium, however, is well distinct from the moratorium that's been maintained at the multilateral level in a few key ways. I mean, the first is this is a plurilateral moratorium, so it would only apply to it would only be benefits to the parties of this potential agreement, which would have important implications if the multilateral moratorium were ever to be expiring. This would then, there are important implications on such matters. The second key element is there are important clarifications on the definition of what is meant by electronic transmissions. This essentially and versus what's been currently agreed to at the multilateral level. It's important. It's interesting to note that this definition clarification is now also included in the U.S. proposal at the multilateral level. But what this clarification on the definition essentially means is that the parties are willing to sign up to they're agreeing to provide duty-free access to quite a broad scope of digital products, from goods to services. That's the commitment when it comes to having clarified this definition. Another key way in which this moratorium is distinct from the current moratorium is just that it's expected to also function in practice as a permanent moratorium, which is of course different from the current approach at the multilateral level, where the moratorium gets maintained on a temporary basis. So these are some of the key elements of this article. Beyond the openness related type commitments, another important type of commitment in this agreement are essentially, many of them are regulatory commitments. This is probably one of the more prevalent type of commitments in this agreement. And what parties are essentially committing to through these types of provisions is they're committing to put in place certain types of measures and frameworks that are regarded as important for ensuring that there's a certain type of predictability and transparency in regards to the regulatory environment to essentially facilitate the operation of the digital economy. In essence, these types of commitments are indicating a party's readiness for digital regulatory their commitment for digital regulatory readiness, that they're committing to ensure that certain types of frameworks have been established that are relevant for the digital economy needs. Here you can see some of these examples of these types of provisions, and I'm happy to go into some of the details during the Q&A if need be, but this is probably the most prevalent type of commitment that's included in this agreement. Another type of commitment in this agreement is there's a couple of trade facilitation plus type commitments in which the parties are promising to leverage certain types of put in place certain types of electronic systems, or ensure that the availability of certain types of paper formats, all with the purpose of ensuring that customs procedures become a little bit more efficient for the trade in goods. And finally, another key type of provision to take note of is that the parties would be committing to put in place certain types of regulatory principles that are specifically relevant within the telecoms sector. It's essentially, the idea is that these types of regulatory principles and safeguards would be an important way to reduce the market access, behind the border market access condition barriers, specifically within the telecommunication sectors. There's quite a lot of binding commitments in this area that are well worth further reviewing and examining. So this gives you an overview of the different types of substantive commitments in this agreement. It's quite varied and yeah. Beyond the substantive articles, it's important to note that there is also an article that's focusing on development, which essentially outlines what are the specific benefits and flexibilities that are available to developing country and LDC members in particular when it comes to potentially implementing this agreement. It's a detailed article, but essentially the main takeaway in regards to the benefits and flexibilities that are available to these types of members is these members can request essentially a longer period of up to 5 years to implement any of the substantive provisions of this agreement if need be, and also if that initial deadline of the period of up to 5 years, if that's not met, they can also ask for an additional 2 years of extension if need be. So that's the main flexibility that's available to developing countries and LDCs in particular in regards to this agreement, to help determine to help assess if what flexibilities would be needed. There's also a potential that they can request support for needs assessment studies. Donor parties are encouraged to essentially provide that kind of support. So that's another key point to take note of. So this gives you a quick overview. It's a very dirty overview on the types of provisions in this agreement, but it's to give you an idea of what parties are signing up to if they are interested in joining this initiative, and if this agreement were to ever become a reality. I'm going to finish this presentation with sharing some reflections that could be relevant for developing countries in particular. So when it comes to developing country engagement, we've seen that well, the engagement, the actual participation in the negotiations, it was quite varied and somewhat limited. But that doesn't mean that you know, this isn't a topic that is at the forefront of a lot of developing countries. Mines, many of them are still in the process of trying to figure out and evaluate what are some of the benefits and reasons as to why they would want to um, join this initiative, and to see if there is an interest in potentially eventually considering whether they would want to adopt any of the obligations of this agreement. And as such countries kind of take these kinds of do these kinds of assessments, we do recommend having two key considerations in mind as they do these kinds of evaluations. The first is it is really key to evaluate the implementation capacity and needs to be in a better position to, if there is an interest in implementing eventually any of these provisions of this agreement, it's key to understand what is the capacity and needs to successfully implement this agreement. As I mentioned, a lot of the provisions in this agreement are regulatory commitments, which means that for many developing countries, and especially LDCs, it essentially requires them to put in place at times new regulatory measures and frameworks, and also to have the capacity to maintain those frameworks. So in order to be successful, it is key to leverage the needs assessment studies in particular, because it helps countries can be in a position to essentially assess to what extent their current domestic regulatory framework is complying with the obligations of the agreement, whether there is a need for capacity support, and how much of that support is needed. And such studies can also help assess whether how much additional time they would need to implement any of all the regulatory commitments and the obligations of this agreement. Such studies can help assess, will the 5-year extension period, is that enough? Is that flexibility enough? Or will there be a need for additional time beyond that, which of course would have important implications on how a country would approach their ratification strategy. So these are things that don't need to be delayed. It can be the assessment should be carried out right away to help evaluate like what the position would be on such matters. The second key element that countries are evaluating is essentially understanding their position on the customs duties on electronic transmissions. This is a key article within this agreement, and for a lot of developing countries, it is key to essentially understand, to engage in discussions around it, to assess what is your position on this matter. Would you want to support the permanent plurilateral moratorium, and or is there essentially a position on wanting to maintain policy space on these matters? So these are the kinds of conversations that are needed, and that a lot of countries are at present currently engaging in. So this gives you essentially let's say a quick summary of what developing countries are still in the process of considering as they evaluate their position on this initiative.
Super. Thank you very much indeed, Rashmi. And to those who've asked in the chat, don't worry, we will be sharing all of the slides and the recording of this webinar. And of course, if you are signed up to ISD's Tradecraft, you can also make sure that you're among the first to see the state of play, which explains some of these provisions and exactly what they require in more detail. So again, thank you also to those who've put questions in the chat. We've seen them. We are discussing amongst ourselves how to best cover them when we get to the discussion. But first, it's my great pleasure to invite perhaps first Joel and then Cecilia to provide some discussants' perspectives on the state of play. And I think we're interested, I mean, from both of you, to the extent you feel comfortable, we're interested in the priorities and the areas on the WTO's multilateral work program, and the dynamics in the plurilateral. So to the extent you're comfortable speaking to either of those, please do. So Joel, I'll hand you the floor first. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Alice. Thanks for your very efficient moderation of this session. Thanks to Rashmi and Rashid as well for very insightful presentations. I'm not sure how much time I have. There's a lot to unpack as well, but I will try to keep it as disciplined as possible. And I will start with some reflections on the moratorium. And I'm very happy that Rashid took us back to 1998 when the decision first came into being. And the premise I want to start on links to a question I see in the chat about the idea that if the technology exists for us to be able to impose customs duties, why not do it? And I want to go back to the reason why in 1998 that decision was so critical to implement the moratorium at that time. The conventional thinking in trade and economic circles at the time on tariffs was that tariffs were important in terms of protecting infant industry, for example, to protect domestic production and to provide a platform for domestic firms to be able to compete globally. And that's why many countries, if you look at the WTO bound rates in the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs on Trade, you'd realize that a number of countries, in addition to their applied tariffs, do maintain very high bound tariff rates because of this idea that tariffs provide that level of protection. Now, the inverse argument was made with respect to the moratorium on customs duties on e-transmissions, because there was a thinking that that imposing tariffs, or that possibility of imposing tariffs on electronic transmissions, would have the opposite effect of what tariffs would do for competitiveness of goods in the classical sense. And so the idea was to allow the industry, which was still in its infancy at the time, the space to grow and to develop without the encumbrance of the kind of potential disruption that could have come from tariffs at the time. And I want to make the argument that that perspective still very much holds today. Because in as much as we have made significant strides with respect to the growth of the digital economy, we still have a very long way to go. And many developing countries and least developed countries have still not attained that level of digital industrialization, which would warrant the kind of disruption that would come from imposing tariffs on customs on electronic transmissions. And what I would say as well, if we look at what is happening with the America First tariffs and the kind of disruptions we've seen when you impose tariffs in a way that they were not being imposed before, it creates significant global disruption. And I believe that this is a cautionary tale in terms of what could happen to the global digital economy should we move away from the moratorium. So I thought it very important to get that out of the way. There are some dynamics which are taking place around the moratorium, and Rashid very well set the context for us in terms of the different options which members are currently considering. I believe that it was a mistake in Abu Dhabi to end up with an outcome in the way that it was. There was the pressure of the negotiating room, of course, and then there was that sense that any kind of outcome, just to renew it, would be better than not having it at all at the time. But that's negotiating pressure, that's what it does. So we now have the added complication of having to first and foremost have members agree that we're going to revisit that decision that was made in Abu Dhabi. So that's the first political battle that needs to be fought in Geneva by negotiators. Because that agreement that was taken in Abu Dhabi is now part of it. It's legal, right? So we have a legal obligation to end the moratorium in 2026, March 2026. And so that's the first battle. But then the additional battle comes from now this idea of putting forward the permanent moratorium. And that's a bit of a misnomer, because the moratorium is ideally temporary, but for our purposes today, we refer to it as a permanent moratorium, and we see where the United States is leading us in that regard. So there's going to be a political battle where that is concerned, because we now have to convince members that we revisit the decision of Abu Dhabi, we have a permanent moratorium, but also there are those who are saying let's renew. Now, I don't fundamentally believe that there's anything inherently disruptive from putting in place a permanent moratorium. What I have a concern with is the silence on the work program in the United States communication. My discussions with persons involved in the US's um, landscape is that they're not opposed necessarily to a work program. So then it's for those who see value in the work program to put that forward. And I believe, I suspect there is going to be a bit of a merger between the ACP proposal, which is a very balanced proposal because it retains the elements of the work program, but also a renewable moratorium. And that is likely going to be merged for the purposes of negotiations in Geneva with the United States text. And then we'll then have to reconcile the position of members who don't want a moratorium at all. Now, what could potentially happen is that when you look at what is happening in the US bilateral agreements, you see that the US is binding countries like Indonesia and Malaysia and Guatemala, El Salvador, to a permanent moratorium and them supporting it in the WTO as well. So if the United States is sufficiently invested in this, it would be interesting to see if in their own bilateral discussions with India and South Africa, if they achieve maturity ahead of the ministerial, whether they will get them to go in a similar way. So I'm not going to bet against us ending up with a permanent moratorium. If it is, you have a major player like the United States very much invested in it, and we already have the 70 odd JSI members that want it. And so it would be up to developing countries now to ensure that they're very strong in terms of pushing for the continuation of the work program, which still has value for them. And I think that's enough on the moratorium. I'll just quickly speak to the issue of the e-commerce JSI. And again, thanks again, Rashmi, for very insightful comments and presentation. I saw a question in the chat as well around the whole issue of how do we go ahead and implement this particular agreement. There's several options available. Of course, having it legally incorporated into the WTO's legal architecture gives it a bit of credibility. And of course, it would benefit from all of those features of an agreement being incorporated into the WTO. But that's not the only option. There's the option of a standalone international treaty. Of course, there's the option of the provisional application. That would be problematic for those members which in their own domestic legal system does not allow for provisional application of international treaties. That does happen in some instances, but those options are available. But I think the JSI nonetheless suffers from what I would refer to as somewhat of a design flaw. And that design flaw was there in 2017 when members came up with this idea in terms of how they went about doing it and the lack of openness, inclusivity, and transparency in agenda setting for this JSI. A design flaw in terms of the actual negotiations, because being in Geneva throughout most of that period, and I saw how the pathways for meaningful engagement by non-members, including developing country non-participants in this negotiation, how those pathways closed, right? So there's a design flaw there as well. And there's also a design flaw in terms of what's happening post finalization of that agreement, in terms of how they're going about trying to get members to agree. And again, the lack of a meaningful consultative approach with the broader membership, especially those members that have challenges, to see how they can incorporate their concerns. What I would close on is basically to say that I do not anticipate that at the next ministerial conference that we will resolve this challenge with the incorporation of the JSI, and especially with the United States having participated in the negotiations, walking away from those negotiations. And it's not just a political walking away, there are some substantive concerns that they have around issues of data flows and a number of other things. And of course, developing countries legitimately have concerns about the inadequacy of the development provisions. And when you compare those development provisions with those in the investment facilitation agreement, where you have language such as should, in terms of the obligations placed on the donor members, you'd realize that there is a gap where the developmental ambition is concerned. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you very much. And hopefully I didn't exceed my time.
Not by too much, Joel. And as usual, it was always extremely insightful. So for anyone on listening to the webinar or the recording who's not a trade negotiator, you've just had a masterclass in how trade negotiators think about these things and the various dynamics involved at both multilateral, plurilateral, and even bilateral level. So Joel, thank you. That was really interesting. Cecilia, thank you for being so patient. How do you see these various issues coming together? Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this discussion. It's never easy to be the last to speak, especially after this fantastic two presentations, and of course, Joel, as always, so clear and so precise in its comments. And thank you for Rashid and Rashmi for presenting the topic so much in detail, and also thank you, Joel, for referring extensively to the moratorium, because in that way I can focus on other elements and we can that beside the moratorium, right? So first of all, I would like to I mean, it was quite clear for me from Rashid and Rashmi's presentation, but I think it's important to remember that the work program and the negotiations within the joint initiative serves two different purposes that can be also mirrored to two different functions of the WTO. We have the deliberative function, and then we have the negotiation function. And this is how we see the work program is, as Rashid, I will absolutely subscribe to your final state that the work program is the only multilateral forum within the WTO for structured dialogue on e-commerce. And this is purely the deliberative function of the WTO. And some of the topics that we have been discussing during the last, I would say from the ministerial conference in 2022 have been active and engaged, and they have been very rich, and that have provided the members, at least from Argentina, we see a lot of value, because we have been sharing information, sharing experiences, and learning from other members on how they face the e-commerce, how they develop the regulatory frameworks, and how they deal with some of the challenges that arise from the expansion of the digital economy, that will not have another forum within the WTO to be discussed in such a horizontal way. And I think that's an important feature of the work program, although the original mandate was also for the subsidiary bodies. If I may, also in some other topics within the WTO, we see that sometimes members pose the question of if it is really useful to have discussions in different silos or different bodies, and they have a call for more across the organization discussion. And I think that this is a feature of the work program that is extremely valuable, and it should be kept for the future. So from the point of view of Argentina, the work program has provide this platform for discussions and deliberations. We have seen a lot of value, in particular on the discussions about the regulatory frameworks in different topics and elements that were discussed there. One that for Argentina has been really interesting, for example, is how we protect consumers, and how we adapt the existing consumer protection regulatory frameworks in order to make it also valid for the digital context and the e-commerce. Or at least that's what we have heard from most members, that we already have the framework, we needed to adapt it to the to this different environment. And that has been very enlightening and rich discussions that we have. Of course, we have also discussed a lot about the digital gap. That for Argentina has been an interesting discussion. We face problems in particular regarding connectivity. I mean, I think that most people can agree with me that Argentina is a very large country regarding the territory. It is not easy to provide connection to every corner of the country. Luckily, we now have satellite services, for example, that helps connect different parts of the country. But for us, also the gap between rural connection and connection in cities is a concern regarding digital gap that has been also discussed and explained in the context of the work program. That it's something that we have seen a lot of value. Also, we have discussions regarding digital literacy and how members deal with the challenge, and a lot of enriching discussions and learning from the experience of other international organizations. So to wrap up this idea for Argentina, this platform of deliberation, it's unique, and we see a lot of value in renewing the mandate for the work program. And we hope, because also some of the topics that we have discussed and addressed within the work program will not have a place in another context different, like a negotiating platform like the GSI, which also serves this different purpose to give the opportunity and the platform for the members that are ready to do so to advance to negotiate rules. And I think that in this regard, I would like to mention two aspects. From the point of view of Argentina, we didn't join into all the initiatives from the beginning. We had an assessment on each of them to see to what extent that was useful and that served to Argentina's interest. And then we took the decision to join, and we have been joining the different joint initiatives at different moments. This was one of the initiatives that we joined from the beginning because we saw value in starting to create this multilateral framework for e-commerce. And that leads me to the second comment that I would like to share today, is that for Argentina, it was a particular and interesting exercise because different from other countries, even from other countries close to us, we didn't have a lot of FTAs, including e-commerce as part of the agreement. So we didn't have this opportunity to build on existing agreements, or at least from a few of them when we started the negotiations. So that was an extra effort, but also a valid effort from Argentina to help us upgrade our negotiating platform of FTAs and to include some of the regulatory commitments that we didn't have before arising from any FTA. So from that point of view, also, I think that that was a particular experience from Argentina and some other developing members, but it was also very valid for us as part of our efforts to join the agreement on e-commerce. And regarding the future of these two frameworks, well, as I said, for Argentina, it will be very important that the work program is also renewed in the next ministerial. And as Joel mentioned, we hope that we will find a way forward, bridging from the proposals that are already on the table. And as for the GSI, well, I think that there's two. Regarding the future of the GSI, we also have to remember that the agreement includes one article, Article 35, that calls for future negotiations in order to keep the agreement updated, especially in light of the high speed of the advancing technology. So that's one part of the future of the agreement, of the e-commerce agreement. And also, I think that regarding the incorporation into the legal architecture of the WTO is not only, of course, getting the approval to get it into the Annex 4, but also I think that this is a discussion that is very much linked to the reform of the organization that we are having now, these discussions. And I think that at some point also both elements are linked, and we have to be paying attention to what happened into that other discussion in order to be to see what are the prospects, not only for the e-commerce agreement, but for any other plurilateral discussion and negotiation that is going to be taken in, or that eventually can happen within the WTO. And just to end my comments, to remember that for the participants in the GSI, it has always been the main objective to get the final agreement incorporated into the WTO and to make it a WTO agreement. So those two discussions are going to be very, very important for us. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Super, Cecilia, that's really, really interesting. And maybe just two quick comments before we move to the discussion. As Rashmi was saying, one of the ideas behind the joint statement initiative, particularly on e-commerce, was to set a sort of global baseline of rules on digital trade. And so to bring in a number of common rules from FTAs and make those a global baseline. But it's interesting to hear them from Argentina's perspective, that there was also sort of a reverse effect, right, of being able to move some of those baselines back into your FTA practice, which is interesting. And a very last comment before we move to the discussion, for those, again, who aren't WTO hacks like the rest of us here, the link that Cecilia is referring to WTO reform is a discussion that's going on a lot in Geneva at the moment that talks about how decisions are taken within the WTO, linked to one of these questions, as Rashmi was saying, and the fact that some of this the plurilateral negotiations and the plurilateral treaties are struggling to become incorporated into the overall WTO treaty architecture because some members have concerns about the existence of joint statement initiatives. So there's a broader sort of political discussion going on about how the negotiating function of the WTO should be used. So just as a quick sidebar, that's what the WTO reform discussion refers to, among other things. So thank you very much indeed.